before they actually introduced movement to art and sculpture in specific. It was more about just a visual movement. So maybe around the 30s. Particular people wouldn't even be brought up in kinetic art usually. Is a fellow named Maxwell who just did a couple optical illusions. I think he had a lot of mathematical training, so he was sort of preconceiving what we were going to do with 3D printing just by kind of defying logic of formal design. One of his first pieces, he was almost giddy when someone encountered it and didn't assumed it to be symmetrical, and then on closer inspection, is kind of betrayed to something that's just, off. Also, Brancusi, one of my favorites. Some of his stuff here is his workshop where he's working with these columns in the background. So repeating forms often, and this is his famous piece, Bird in Space. Marcel Duchamp tried to import it to America, and the political climate of the times, they made him charged him a materials tax, assuming it was just raw material, because sculpture obviously can't just be something this minimalist. It has to be more figurative. But the figure of this, it's something that our people inherited just with atomic and space exploration. Here's Brancusi hanging out in his older age. These pieces look interesting. They're not necessarily kinetic, but they have gravities. The poster boy for constructivism out in Russia is this guy. This is a fabrication that's never existed. It was only like a 9-foot tall. Here's it on a podium, a 9-foot tall, 16-foot tall representation of maybe like a new revolutionary government building. I don't know where the parliament would live, but if you see the scale once it is designed, like photoshopped in, they were assuming that this giant Mickey Mouse matador ride was just going to climb into space, being at least twice as high as the highest thing that the people that invented in the 1920s or so. But this is an actual thing, just a black and white photo of a 16-foot tall structure. And it's got in it implied movement all about. But when it comes to art, things aren't necessarily art until the most previous form of art had been discovered. So like stuff like Robert Rauschenberg these days, it's just like collages of like scrapped fabric from his bed, and just like painting messes on walls, and it just wouldn't have made sense. It wouldn't be worth $20 million unless it was kind of made in the 1960s, 1950s, and it was the first one to try to break through particular boundaries of what art was there to accomplish. So that's what they say about Calder a lot, is he's the one that broke through and brought motion to art. But Duchamp was doing stuff like that too. His particular were his records for your eyes. That he played on this, which is a roto relief. Oh yeah, and if you want to follow along, just head back to Kinematics, and then Kinematics 5. I accidentally put an S in it today. So roto reliefs are just like hypnotic patterns. They're starting to change art to be about perception. It's kind of a postmodern thing to do, I guess. You really had to be there to watch something spin at an RPM and then perceive the symmetries or the warbles. Yeah, Marcel Duchamp, I think he had one or two other stabs at making kinetic art, but the other guy that was of the Dada, Duchamp, and my favorite guy, what's his name? He would do the first cinematographic Dada films where it was just like a bunch of salt. Yeah, his name's Man Ray. He'd just take photographs of salt and then play a video of like throwing pistachio shells on the film itself. So he was a photographer, and he made a thing called the rayogram, which is just kind of almost it's kind of like a solar print, except it's done with a photographic film. So he'd expose actual objects to photographic film. He did work with a towel where it was just hanging. It might have been a paper. Stuff like this, where this one right here is the famous one that kind of started kinetic art, sort of. He just held a towel, it's this particular piece of paper, and just held it in midair, and just by hanging it, what is this now? Art has always been something on walls, and luckily he would do this intermediarily, where he'd do the same technique in a sculptural piece. He'd also do in a photographic transform. So this would be called a rayogram. You can just kind of understand it's just like black and white gradients of how much light could expose the photographic plate. And so by suspending things, you get kind of shadow zones where it's not particularly precise where it exists in space. So it's definitely a dialogue between the material and the technique of photography, rather than just saying like everyone takes pictures through a pinhole camera. This piece is probably just a random piece of surrealism. It looks a little bit like Max Ernst's works. Max Ernst's not necessarily kinetic drawing, but his particular pieces like this that look kind of like ancient coral. He supposedly invented them by just taking pieces of wood and then putting paint on them, and then pressing pieces of wood with paint on a surface of canvas, and then just inheriting kind of like a random biomorphic form, and then detailing it from there. So he was a very experimental collager that would start with kind of like chaos, and then try to return it to human forms or architectural forms. But these juxtapositions, like this is a famous piece. It's like half steam boiler, half bowl. Just a painted piece. Surrealism, for whatever reason, offered new possibilities for art that kinetic art inherited. Other names. This guy was more of an op artist, Victor Vasarely. He'd do sculptural presentations out in the grass of objects that almost were just like for your eyes. It looks kind of like it doesn't belong in a garden so much as in like this abstract space of the internet. Looks like it fits better. But these are hand-drawn things. They were experimenting with like pre-Photoshop filters. But oftentimes when you encounter kinetic art, you encounter an illusion. And so Vasarely was definitely in the illusion space. One of my favorites is this guy, Jan Arp, and his process of making art was kind of kinetic. Sometimes he would just drop pieces of plywood that he had offered these strange contours. You can see like this ellipse is just it's just a piece of plywood that's been jigsawed to a strange form. He would just take these pieces and you just throw them, and you'd get almost like readings or meditations on what art is. So if you take 7 pieces of kind of strangely formed plywood shapes, and then you just throw them 100 times, you could take pictures or just choose the one that just seemed to work best, and almost save yourself the effort of having to design the piece. So throwing, the art's composition was just made by motion. But it's just a stagnant piece on the wall at this point. Yo, Jessica, we got this website today. It's a little different than usual because I added an S, so it's Kinematics 5. I'm just going over a lot of those big names that kind of started kinetic art. Early stuff like Max Bill and Tatlin, they're like mathematically derived illusions, or so if you can think of like a mathematical equation as movement, but it in itself is just sculpture that sits there. I think Rodchenko, he had 2 bodies of work. One was a certain type of op art, optical illusion art, where you take pictures of repeating forms, you can just see like every single one of these pieces has the same premise, like find a grid, find an unfolding pattern, and like take it in a displayed space. But he also did graphic design for posters and stuff, where you use a lot of like plexiglass straight lines. I don't know, that's just the way that Soviet art is often. It's very, very straight art. But his sculpture, he might have been the first person to do a kinetic sculpture in the air. Google's not too happy about me clicking on this, but this object wouldn't necessarily move. It would move to your eye, but it's all just one piece of wood that's a bunch of concentric circles glued or wired together to be exactly that form. And then it would rotate in a space. And, you know, it was the first time someone had just said, like, well, I'm just going to hang my art. Stuff like chandeliers never really went past craft. And so that might have been a return to like a chandelier concept, a hanging mobile. Maybe the first guy to just say enough's enough, let's just do random permutations was Noam Gabo. One of his bodies of work was these wire transforms. You can imagine it's just like a loom done on a steel rim. Probably pretty time intensive, and you can see he's getting moire patterns. I'm not sure when the mathematician Moire was around. Huh. Yeah, but it's only able to go to like the local internet right now. Like these are my website's pictures. But yeah, these are two examples of moire patterns that, or this is one I've done, where you just take two repeating forms. This might have been like the light bright board, and then just screen print them. And then depending on the phase of the two, then you're going to get different combinations of kind of like negative space clusters. You can see a frequency. If those two pieces of paper are rotated a little bit more, then you're going to get a different frequency, and it breaks down to smaller circles to be where you see the white. Pretty cool. Just a pop art kinetic thing. I like to think of it as if you rotate this piece of paper just 1 degree, if you did it at the right time to another piece of paper, then you're actually moving the optical pattern. Say you moved through 1 degree, it was only like 1 inch of rotation, but the optical pattern might move through what it seems like 5 inches of speed, because sometimes the optical illusion is faster than the actual physical motion of the paper. Yeah, so Jan Arp or Hans Arp. I accidentally wrote down the name Claude Debussy, but I mistaken him. He's a pentatonic composer. Claude Debussy is the one I was after. He is not necessarily moving art, but just what he was doing, where he'd set up sculptures and columns that were just kind of 3D drawings. He just contoured the space. It almost looks like a Sobel transform, like image detection, like you're looking for edges. He would just do edge detection for you on his art. Big name. I don't know if it's kind of a diluted kind of art, like what does it mean at this point? This guy, I've seen some of his galleries. He has one in Santa Fe, where you just see a nice garden with hundreds of these kind of silly trinket oddities out there, and they all have optical illusions, and they're all controlled by the wind. They just rotate. If you're lucky, he would do like dual bearing, triple bearing systems, so that a pattern that looks like this and a pattern that looks like that are rotating on the same fulcrum, one clockwise, one counterclockwise. So you're gonna see some fun stuff. One like this. It looks like it's just stagnant in a way. Like these two rooms are completely interconnected. So just like Rodchenkow's first work, all it does is just rotate and then makes a path disposal. But I'd say, I don't know, for some reason I just feel like he's like a pop artist, Like he's the one that does kinetic art that people that want a piece of kinetic art in their lobby or hospital foyer get. But I don't know, at this point he's probably just got 10, 20 different galleries around America that just hawk his wares for like $500 to $20,000. And he might be still making them, but when an artist gets to that point, usually they just have, like a workshop. It's the best way to expand. Just have people follow your principles. Probably the best example of that is Phineas Rembrandt, or just another big name in painting. And he just had 20 workers that would just make his portraits, his like epic battles of say like the variants of Napoleon, the big kind of war and horse holding a sword up kind of pictures, or like the night watchman crew. Something that looks kind of heroic, but then he would just walk around and he'd just do the hands and the faces. That's all he was responsible for as the artist that puts the signature on the piece. Just the real true details are his responsibility. But yeah, if YouTube was working, you could see some of Lyman Whitaker's works, and it's pretty cool. But I don't know what it means. If you compare Calder's mobiles to Whitaker's, you get something special. So Calder's a little bit of an anarchist. He's kind of a self-taught, rowdy guy that just never necessarily agreed with any formal structure. Like hold on to a job for a little bit. Luckily, he got into art positions where it was his job to go to events and illustrate them for the public newspaper. So he just wouldn't make any choice really. He just kept making art, and then luckily I caught on. I think he has about 3 bodies of work. These are all examples of his mobiles. And I would just say like airmobiles and balance. And they just look like a spotted tentacle monsters of contingency. But he's also got object mobiles, which are a fun breed. Some people criticize them that they didn't really offer anything in kinetic art. All it is say like take a 3D shape, take 2 3D shapes. Hey, why not just a bunch of stuff like put like 3 things in a space and then have like a turn crank over here or an automatic motor. And then like this one would rotate, this one would rotate, and then this one would dip. And it would be on a piece of on a platform on the ground. It could be 5 inches to like 2 feet tall. And I think usually automated once you got to that point where and then you just go into a space and there'd be like this abstraction of what nowadays is just an automata. He did some pretty cool ones. Supposedly he was really inspired by like solar systems and planetary systems. So a lot of these are what he would refer to as his own sky. Like he had like hundreds of these in his barn, and then it's just kind of like owning the atmosphere. So object sculptures were just like turning things on the ground, kind of like cuckoo clocks. But then his other stuff was stabiles, which are just kind of back to before kinetic art, where the kineticist of art was just stuff that looks like it's moving. So he'd do abstractions that look like swordfish or just like streaks and arcs. If I was lucky, I could just write in stabiles and you'd see. There's some famous ones. You usually just paint them red. I like to joke that artists that make it big, they're just into primary colors. Just red and black is all you really need. But he get giant foreman crews to do this stuff. And I don't think he's killed anyone with his sculptures, which is something that kinetic artists have to worry about a bit. Oh, that one on the lower left looks like a good hybrid where it's almost an object mobile. It's both a stabile and an object mobile. But every single one of his pieces wouldn't follow a formula. He'd just be tinkering away and he'd come up with a new formula for how it works or why it works or what's the balance I'm looking for. Which is the best thing about him is that people couldn't pirate his method. They couldn't make a fake Calder, because to do that they would have to follow the equation, and he just never really concluded on an equation. Just kind of a dreaming individual. I hear that he had daily practice in the morning to just wake up and the first thing he'd do is just do like a gouache print, just like primary colors and big swinging brushes, and just just do an abstraction every morning to get the creative process started. Yeah, I might be able to reset and watch some YouTube videos of some of these characters. But I wanted to show you a contemporary. He's probably like the biggest name in kinetic art for a while still, is Theo Jansen. He's got a book called The Great Pretender, which, I don't know, it demystifies his art form. He's known for his strand beasts. E-A-S-T. And they look like they're out of the Dune movies, you know. They're just giant blimps in some cases, but they're self-powered. They integrate the Theo Jansen kind of crab linkage on their legs with a drivetrain that also has these long wings. And as elegant as they look, you read his book and you find out that all it is just this like kind of rawhide PVC tubing that they sell in Europe. And that's about it. Just twine, PVC tubing, and cardboard. He lived in or just had his art studio in a shipping container on a beach in a very quiet place, perhaps in Sweden. I forget if that's his particular origin. But he's like 50 or 60, and so he just kind of invented this new kinetic language. His specific ratio for his crab legs is sort of a new linkage, something that no one really sort of invents anymore. I think it's something like this. You get two of those, and then you do crosses. And then you just put three of these in duplicates on top of each other. And then one's drivetrain is to 120, one's to 240, and the other's to 0. And you just turn the crank on the drive, and the drivetrain just looks like that from the side. And then these characters will walk, and then all of these are just open links so that they can move as freely as the linkages would allow them to. In some cases, you have to connect 4 points. But they have stability. Like here's a 4-bar linkage, and then 2 triangles. But the fun thing is that they don't do anything by themselves. He always has to put them in 3s. I guess they work in 3s. You could probably work, I don't know, maybe it just works in 3s. Might just glitch it up to make a 4 at 90 degrees. I really like this one. It just there's no negative space in it, so you really feel like it's a monster that's trying to get back. All the other ones, they look like bone dragons, which as scary as a dragon is, it's already dead, so. Yeah, so I think they're the exact same linkage system, but he just did it out of cardboard and they call it the rhinoceros all of a sudden. I don't know about this one where he put kind of that old movie Flight of the Navigator where they just have these giant kind of conical ram scoops on them. But earlier ones just had these striding beams. So he had a Mercedes-Benz commercial. That was probably like why America knows about him, because Mercedes wanted to say like we were innovative like Theo Jansen. But you can think of like the difference between what Theo's after and what Mercedes is after. And so it's just eye candy at that point. But the funnest part about his book is that he just has pictures of his tools. So this is his raw material. Calder's raw material is just baling wire. Theo's is this Euro tube, he calls it. And he said that he started working with a heat gun, and he realized that if you work at heat gun power level 2, then it works faster, but then your art falls apart in like a year or less. And so it was kind of like a time release thing that he found out. Like after doing art for a while, he realized that all his art was falling apart, and then he was like, okay, I guess I gotta start over and work a little bit slower, not turn the stuff to brittle. So some of his simple methods and tools, the fold and tie, or the twist, I don't know how he made those ones. Here's a sliding, kind of like a solenoid. Here's connecting 4 or 5 together to make an axle. Yeah, so it looks like he worked in at least 2 different sizes to get sliding motions. Maybe a day on the beach with a hot knife could get you one of these. But he treats them as if they're biological species, which is interesting to think of if they have motion. In artificial life studies, they say, like, well, what are the 7 primary indicators that life is actually existent? You know, if we're going to imitate it with a computer, like, what's it really have to do? And I'm sure that these ones would accomplish 2 of them. They can't reprocreate, but they definitely have certain self-awareness in that they can travel all by themselves. So he's a great person to study if you want to just know about self-made hardware and methodology. Just, you know, if you have to invent it, and all you can do to invent it is start from scratch with your raw materials people. There's his workspace. Yeah, hand designed jigs are always a cool inventory. Every artist that just kind of creates their own methodology has a bunch of tools that no one else has. Yep, so it's called The Great Pretender, which is maybe alludes to being a beast amongst other beasts that came from another origin. So color mobiles. Supposedly there's 2 different ways to make mobiles. Allegedly, the first way is with a balancer. Take a piece of cardboard, cut it like this, fold it, put a thumbtack through this side, and then put a thumbtack to this side. Use the guiding hole from the first thumbtack's fold to make the hole for the second one. And then you have a little pinch point. You just hold it right there, and then you have the dot right there that pinches it. So if ever you want to find the center balance of something, say you have a shape, and you're like, well, where is the center? And you keep poking it until, you know, it balances as best it can. So you take any awful shape, and there's one, well, yeah, not necessarily just one place, but you know, there's going to be this place, and you could probably go down here, you know. All of those points would be balanced, and what is balanced, perhaps just as level as possible. You know, so it's really up to you. There's probably a 20% or at least 5% zone where you could say, well, it's tipping to the left, so if I'm going to put something else on it, I should tip it to the right next time. But the fabrication methodology is you start from the bottom, and you balance that, and then keep going up, and balance that, and after a while you have something that just stands in midair, and it seems strange, but it shows that there's only some mobiles that are legal. Like, if you're making mobiles with this method, then you can have all these shapes that you want to put together, but you're restricted to how they're allowed to be connected. When things rotate in 3D space, they also have the chance to knock against each other. Some of my early wind sculptures were just like high-powered fans, and they weren't phase protected, so there are certain permutations of where the fan blades were at the same time, where they would just make this giant clanging noise. No iPhone users were killed with the making of those high-powered fans, which I can show you. It's on this website. Some early welding stuff I did back in like 2008. It was just like a giant ant monster made out of swing sets. all these podiums are just made out of speakers from organs. This is a kinetic sculpture that Harry Bertoia invented. I'll just show you Harry. It's out of Philadelphia. He might have died like in the 70s because he used too many experimental metals for his art. But he invented wire chairs as well as these hanging columns. And this particular kind of piece he did, 100 editions of with different types of metal and lengths of metal. And those like cymbal heads that give really thick metal a heavier weight so that they can still be kinetic. The thicker the metal you get, the less it's really going to want to do anything. So it's an easy casting process where you just take parallel grids of metal, slide everything through, and then turn it sideways, and then cast the bottom and then resin. His were originally welded, and for my particular uses, these ones have LEDs on the top of them, so they have this complementary knit of positive and negative energies, such that just by shaking them, instead of making sound, it makes light. It's kind of funny because you have to trade one for the other. This is a kinetic sculpture where I just cut zigzags out of sheet metal and then held them rolled around a center bearing, and when you can just give it a spin, it's like a steel drum with really funny negative space. These are a bit kinetic just because they have a little bit of spring. Particularly for these pieces of metal, which are chassis from power supplies. Originally they had a sound component to them. Maybe they're tempered to be perfect 90-degree angled. So all you do is take a perfectly tempered piece and just give it a bend, and it'll start making a twang or a lang noise, which you can kind of sculpt and make music from. And by the time that they were all tempered out, they call it in like the metal industry, they call it kind of I think it's like working bend, but if you just take a piece of wire and you start bending it after the third bend, it's going to get a little bit, it's going to get brittle but also stiff. So it's needing to been worked. You give it a couple more bends and it's going to break, but at that point it's even harder because tempering, which usually involves heating things, can make things more brittle or harder. Here's one of those pieces that's just a bunch of HP printer cogs rolled into a circle, so that I think at best you can see there's some intermittent spaces between a couple of these points. You roll the first one, and then the energy transfers down 16 of them. These are stabile sculpture with a bunch of printer spools. This is a first example of a linear actuator made, where you can see it's got a slider partition made out of a bed frame rod, and then it's got a linkage right there so that you roll this piece, and then the vertical bar just rolls up and down this open space. When you weld stuff like this, you can weld as much as you want on kind of like extraneous areas, but you really never want to mess with an original straight piece of steel, because as soon as you put a little welt on it, then it's no longer kind of like a frictionless rack and pinion. We're working with these motors in the class. I made an array of them. My original intention was to have, I almost got to it where I had rolls and rolls of streamers. And all of these motors would be called streamers. Each streamer had the rainbow printed on it. It'd be like a 1-inch, 20-inch piece of paper in a band. And then so there's this grid of motors, and on the other side there's this grid of just kind of bearing rolls. And then in theory, like the front plate of all those bearing rolls would have a color image. And then you could use a microcontroller or any kind of electric system to rotate the rolls of color paper. And then this front image, the whole thing would look kind of majestic, just this kinetic view of things. But the front page, and theoretically, you just have a webcam watch it, and then whenever a pixel approaches the right number, you just turn off that number, and then you can create any picture you want. It'd be a really slow display, though. But it would have new possibilities for interpolating. Because if you took a picture of Happy Face and a picture of Sonic the Hedgehog, and then you said, well, change from one to the other, then you get like this very slow interpolation through the rainbow. Before using linkage systems for kinetics, I probably used them more for just architecture. I like to do modular designs. So these particular geodesic domes are just a bunch of F walls that are interconnected, and then they just use a bolt and nut construction, and these washers are welded to the F frames. Here's an example of kind of like a light active shell of recycled plastics on a particular sculpture. Here's what happens if you melt about 200 records in the oven and you just place them concentrically on a core of rods. This has got a xylophone kind of thing, hanging chimes in front of kind of like a speaker sculpture. So I don't think I made too much headway into it, but Edgar Varese and Ioannis Xenakis were both big names in music design, where they set up pavilions that had multitudes of speakers, and then they do compositions for all those speakers, so that if you played all the tapes at the exact corresponding time, you get a cascade effect across speakers. This is a really easy kinetic sculpture to make from steel rod and 2 pieces of sheet metal, say like 1.5 inch square foot, half a foot, 1.5 foot square pieces. You just create 2 spirals, and then you weld them together, and then you pinion one spiral center on the top and the bottom. And then the hanging inner space is a pretty cool spring momentum. This is the side view of a steel barrel that I resin casted with mirror plates. And so it was on a wheelbarrow middle bearing, so you just give it a spin, and it would turn the most mundane sidewalk and lawn into like this revolving shutter speed fragmentation effect. This is a giant house I made for audio spatialization. In theory, all of these little nodes would have a speaker in them, and then you can, in the center, maybe have a pedestal. I originally had this tripod so that it would be like one stick emerging, and then on that would be like a circuit board that you could spatially route where you're hearing sound. I think it was toppled over by some weekend warriors on the campus before he got that far. Here's some light art sculpture of some resin work where you can hang it in midair. You'd be surprised at how much it takes to hang something in midair about 20 feet in the air. You're going to need some big steel to get it up there, and that's just going to topple, all just to put something, like above your head, and you need all this stuff. 3 sides of interlocking foundation. Here's found Albertson shopping cart that's been morphed into kind of like a printed welded form. You can see all these printed parts, printed places. Most steel that's recycled has a layering of say chromium or magnesium or zinc on it. So when you weld it, you're going to burn off that stuff, and then you leave it out in the open air, and all your welds are going to turn brown from the rust of oxidation, which is actually just a slow burning process. So it's kind of cool because you can spot all your welds. Ideally, if you want your stuff to last long, mild steel, just weld and then spray paint all your welds. Here's a Kinetic bike. I think I had to alter the seat before I sold it for like $75. So if we're going to do welding today, you got to know a little bit about welding. What can you know about welding? When you get a tank of oxygen, which is like your fuel, it's like your accelerator. It takes the fuel and says, hey fuel, get louder, get intense. A tank might have like 500 to 300 psi of oxygen in it. And then like you have an 80 cubic foot oxygen tank. I think around like 10 cubic foot oxygen tank. When you're actually outputting from your tank, you're going to have two regulators, one that watches what's in the tank and one that watches what you're asking from the tank. So the one that's in the tank is kind of like a fuel gauge, tells you how much stuff's in there. And then your output regulator is the one that you control with the turn knob. If you turn it completely counterclockwise, it's open and it's closed. Or it's open and closed at the same time. When the valve is open, that means that there's no pressure going. And then as you tighten it, then the pressure starts. So ideally, every time you use your regulators, you open them completely so that nothing can happen while you're storing it. And then when you start up again, you turn on your gas, and then you start turning the regulators until you get to a place where you got enough inner pressure, output. For oxygen, there's no danger zone for how much you can ask of the regulator, but they ask 25 psi. That's just standard. If you ask more of that, then your ratio might get off and you're going to oxidize your welds prematurely. For acetylene, say your tank starts with 200, somehow I can contain that. But your regulator itself, it is dangerous to move acetylene at faster than 25, or faster than 10 or 15. On the regulator it's a red regulator for the red tank. I don't know if red represents blood or what, or just emergency, but you put your fuels in the red tank or black tank. It's easy. You want to make sure that it's just loose. That's the one that can go wrong. You just leave the regulator loose and then turn it up to 5. Turn it up to 6 or 7. I've heard some guys on like the back garages that have done some work in Venice say, don't stay at 25.5. Go up to 6 or 7. Get some work done. So this is oxygen acetylene only 2 regulators for each. And then you have off-board on your torch. You're going to have even more. They're not necessarily regulators, they're just knobs, which pretty much on or off. We have a little bit of attenuation on them. There's so many knobs and bells and whistles. It's kind of difficult. But the most important thing is just leave your acetylene unscrewed. That way it can't go above 5 psi. It can't do something dangerous. One time, a lady that I was sort of like helping out welding, she left the tanks in a completely tightened position. She's like, well, I got to do something, so I was tightening it instead of untightening it. So I didn't check the knob beforehand. All I have to do is unscrew it to prove that it's unscrewed. And I turned it on, and it was just like the numbers just went so high that that's when you blow up. So don't do that. Now everything's got to be tightened with wrenches. That's a little wrench on the regulator there. If you want to find out if your things are tightened completely so you don't have any leaks, sometimes they say put soap on the thread, soapy water, and then you'll see bubbles come out. But the other way to do it is just to open the tanks, get them up to they're pressurized, and the regulator is like holding, and then just close the tanks. And then if the pressure drops, that means that the pressure is being allowed out somewhere. And if you have a good quality welding rig, torches and stuff, you want to keep your tanks tight, but the kind of like the hand turns on like the torch head and most of the things on the torch, you just want hand tighten them. You don't want to wrench tighten them. So here's a picture of the striker. You just give it a scratch and then you get a spark. Welding torches come in 2 main varieties. One's a burning, a cutting torch, and one's a kind of like a fusing, or what is welding torch. It's just this little nozzle tip. You'll see like the orifice on the thing is going to be different. The smaller the pinhole of the nozzle, kind of like the more detailed work supposedly you're doing, and the more or the less gas you're using. Cutting torches, they have like a bunch of holes in them, and the outer rim of holes is oxygen, so it's like 5 different oxygens or 6 different oxygen points, and in the center is the acetylene or the fuel. You can use propane, which is more commonly available than acetylene. You might just need a little bit of a different tip. Just like you can use propane in your combustion engine, but you just have to get like a new carburetor. But it might be worth it because it's like 110 octane. So cutting torch and welding torch. When you start the welder, you turn on the fuel a little bit, and then you use the striker to light the fuel, and then you have this like rosy blast coming out of the torch. And then if that's at the right place, then you just turn the oxygen up slowly, and then they couple. And then these pictures over here are examples of what it's almost like a carrot of fire will look like, and how you can like focus the beam or unfocus it. So you'll have this, ideally you'll have this specific like hot light blue point, and then there'll be this like ray of yellow coming out from it. But it really just takes looking at it and knowing where the specific point is, that it's kind of like a stable mixture. There's a bunch of different glasses you can wear when welding. For oxygen and acetylene, you need to wear like shade 5 glasses, which are usually these little like eye-sized glasses. They have OTC glasses so that you can run over your OTG over the glasses, so that you have to wear a face mask over your glasses. But if you're going to do like electric welding, you need to wear like a whole face mask thing with a shade 10 or 11 or 12. Basically, the only thing you can see through a shade 11 is the sun, which might work out well for you. Often, I appreciate acetylene welding a lot better because you can see, it's practically like wearing dark sunglasses. So you can see the world around you without having to practically relearn how to see in these heavy darkened glasses. I'm always wearing a ventilator, so here's a 2097 from 3M. They're these big pink things. But I think this says 3M is a 300. But there's small particle stuff like dusts, and there's also gas particles, they call them organic vapors. And they make ventilators for both or either. But you really want to get both, because then you're protected from the small stuff and the big stuff. But when you're doing like spray painting, you're doing organic vapor work. When you're doing metal work or welding, you're doing organic vapor work too. There might be dust, but it's really about the gas particles. So the main point is just you could be wearing a dust mask that doesn't do anything for you. So make sure that you're ready for particles and vapors. There's a little bit about geometry. If you hold the tip the more parallel you hold it to the surface, the more that the fire is just going to be like writing off of the surface. So this picture shows that like it's reflecting, the fire reflects. The closer you hold it to a perpendicular, the closer it gets into penetrating. And ideally you just want it radiating with the heat to the point where it turns from like a boring gray to a bright red. And you just keep doing that, and then it'll just start bubbling. And then you're probably a little bit too far. And when you're moving across the welding seam, you can kind of preheat your future by moving in that direction. So I can kind of preheat like this 4th ring while I'm finishing off this 3rd ring so that I can kind of move faster. So you hold, ideally, if you're doing overhead welding, you don't have as many choices about how to hold things, but if you're just doing tabletop work, you can kind of make it easier for you and follow those directions. Or the direction of your work can make your work faster. They have these, like the mainstream torch, like the only company that really makes the professional torch is one called Victor. There's others, but usually everyone just has a Victor. But there's this other company called Cobra or something, and they make a particular acetylene welding ring that's, instead of 25 psi and 5 psi for your fuel, they just do it 5 and 1. And for some reason they have like an exactly small aperture on their welder that can, it can gas weld on aluminum or titanium, like all these other metals that usually can't be welded because this whole acetylene process is very blunt. It has like high air pressure, so it can practically blast through a very thin material. So by the time you weld it up, you just damaged it. So like the Cobra one is the one that they use to weld aluminum onto airplanes, little hobby shop airplanes. So when you're welding things, you have to have them not move while you're welding them. And then after they've like dried, let's say, after they're back to room temperature, then the weld can then accept like all the stress you're asking of it. But if like when you melt something, it can't accept stress. So you have to hold it in a vise or stabilize it. Just like when we're doing plastic welding, you just have to like make it so that it's not moving. It's in stasis while the transformation of the metals can kind of congeal. They say that it's better to weld things that have like an open space between them than it is to weld things that are just butted up against each other. Because when they have an open space in between them, you can start digging in to the depth and just like start filling it in. And that's going to grab onto all this stuff on the left and all this stuff on the right. And hopefully merge all together. But if it's exactly butted together, then all you can really do for penetration is just get into the top. And then you just surface weld it. And so they call it like a bump weld or bad weld. And usually you can prove bad welds, but just like once you made your beautiful thing, you just throw it on the ground. And if it didn't break, then you did a good job. So you practically, you can just go ahead and just try to destroy your thing just to prove that it's indestructible. I wouldn't do that for all works though. But it definitely does prove that the next time it falls, you know, it's a good chance that it's not going to break. So here's the regulators. Left clockwise turn opens them up so that they're less pressure. And it's got a welding torch, just the little cone on it, not the cutting torch. Here's mini tanks, they're so cute. Like here's big tanks, same regulators on the mini tanks. If you put this regulator on this 10 cubic foot acetylene tank and you don't chain it up, it'll just fall over. It's cute. The acetylene store said like it's like a tail wagging a dog. Here's a pipe phonemic press. You just put a pipe through it and then you bend it. And then it's got like 10 tons pressure. And you use these little casted curves to hold the shape that you want it to form into. We'll talk about that a little bit, but maybe later. Here's a giant box I made out of sheet metal that was recycled, and then like the top and the bottom of it, where it used to be kind of like an exhibit space. You know, like you go to like Channel Islands, like a science museum, and they'll have like these really shallow plexiglass boxes. Yeah, I just took that and then just like added 4P to it. Had these nice phonemic releases on the side. I don't know if this design ever panned out very well, but I put like a harp on top of the car, and then each one of these has a slide whistle underneath it, so that they could be tuned. These are all used to be for like feeding old people or youth, you know, that can't feed themselves. So they just like have a macro-sized syringe. But I didn't cut the tops of the syringes off, which I should. And so that was kind of the death of the project. The syringes should have been opened on top, but I left a little dimple on top, so that when I duct taped the PVC tubes that were in themselves tuned, and I just wanted to do micro tuning, I wasn't really able to do anything because there was no like wind communication from the two chambers. Some early stuff. These weren't even using bearings; they're just washers on sticks, really. So any kind of minimalist component you find, like these are like the backs of, someone thought they were the backs of rear view mirrors on the sides of cars. But they're just, you know, just random plastic trash, and I just happened to find like 20, 30 of them so that I could just do a minimalist repetition of them. But these are all examples of different things I've welded. The kinetic stuff, like this is a really great kinetic sculpture. It's kind of like a double helix of these tops. They're like plastic tubs. They used to be on the police lights. And each one has a different length where it's welded to this center thing of metal bar. And then on each side of the bar is like a bearing. So it's actually using a bearing, which is great. All the different lengths, if these are like tightly fastened, the pieces of plastic will resonate in communication with the lengths of steel, so that they actually would be a tuned instrument. And they're on bearings, so they rotate past you. So it's a little bit like a player piano, where it's rolling, you know, you get it start to roll. And then you just play the ones that you can see that are rolling past you. So it's kind of like playing whack-a-mole. And you can see on the ground right beside it is another sculpture that's got these aluminum plates that were fastened to a scooter wheel. You can't necessarily weld aluminum to steel. I'm sure someone's accomplished it, but it's just not something to do. So I just made kind of like a fastener that clamped onto the outer rim. So you can definitely clamp steel onto aluminum. You know, years past, you can always collect this stuff. People are always giving it away. I made a rake out of keys like that. Metal pile, some human forms. This one behind them is like a giant rat cage or a hamster wheel. Might be pictures of here. Like, there's just a bunch of Dell keyboards, and then they're wrapped around these, not bearings, just metal hoops holding them there. And so they're just suspended by 3 pieces of metal to make like a triangle hub. Here's the kind of stuff that I was collecting. All of these are from like a mini trampoline. And then like a lot of scanners have at least 1 spring or 2 springs. Every motor assembly's got a spring. These ones are from futons. All futons have a spring. Early figurative work, you know, it's just like sort of a fish. But you can do like early blacksmithing with welding. All you have to do is just melt this part right here, and then just you can bend both sides of the steel bar. Stainless steel is a different animal than carbon steel or mild steel. They say the more carbon in the steel, the harder it is to weld, but also the closer it is to like a really good tool steel, so you can hold a sharp edge. But stainless steel it's got no iron in it, so it's like vegetarian steel or something. But if it's got no iron, it can't rust. So they say like after society's gone, the last thing around will be our stainless steel. You know, all other steel is gonna, you know, rot or rust in 1,000, 2,000 years. But stainless steel has got like 100,000 years before it's finally affected by, you know, salts and stuff that might be in there. Yeah, so this is the welding website. Just show different projects I did before 2008. This is a fun project where you just get a steel drum and you just bang it on a beach for like just an hour or two. Supposedly you cut it at a 60-40 ratio, so that like your lowest dip is at a 60-40 point, and then it'll just start filling in, and then you get like resonances. I've heard some steel drums that just resound astoundingly. Something to do with the ratio between one side or the other as the sound waves are traveling. At one of my previous schools, we did a lot of trash can installation art. Everyone would just get a panel and just go crazy on what you do with the panel. This one I made a little like tree and skyscraper village, and it was originally made on the ground, and I had to resin cast all these weird pieces of metal onto it. There's different options, but resin is good for casting if you have like plywood, which has lots of grain and texture, so there's lots of stuff to cling to. Here's like a screen printing drawing thing. Oftentimes you're going to find light assemblies in the trash, and all you have to do is just like refurbish them, give them new fixtures on the actual face of them, and they can turn out pretty cool. I've taken in like 10 electronic organs, and maybe 20, and every once in a while you just have like a surplus of a certain material. So this is like an amoeba made out of all the different keys on them. This is a hilarious little thing. It's just the actual device originally, but I just gutted it of its plastic, and then just made this little metal holder to hold the exact same thing that it originally was. So I just changed the aesthetic completely of the object. This is a drum machine I sort of made out of the inner metal meshes from, this says like 7 CTR monitors. It's probably a bad idea to ever crack open a CTR monitor because it has like mercury and cadmium in it. Cadmium probably is like 10 times more dangerous than most anything else you could smoke. So don't ever weld refrigerators or like steel that's from like before the 20s because it has stuff that we didn't know was toxic in a really bad way on it. But it's tempting. You just wear a mask if you're going to go for it. Organic paper mask. These particular pieces were blanks for an extruder. You've probably seen extruders, that's how all spaghetti is made, where they just push material through shape. And as long as the extruder clip has a shape that's stable, then the material can go through it. So these were made for a clay extruder, but you can think about what is a stable shape. It's a trick to make an extruder clip that holds a tube. Then you have to use like the strap-on cloth that holds the outer stencil that lets play through the middle. And then this inner stencil is just a ring. And just from a side view, you have your lower stencil. But then you hold the ring like right above it. Or I think it's right in the middle, but it's suspended by like 3 clock links, so that clay can still get through to the ring zone. So you run across this all the time when doing stencil work, is that you can't float an object in the middle. It would just fall out. So different practices here with an extruder solve the problem in different ways. Screen printing solves the problem because you can suspend inner shapes on the screen itself. But this website's just off of my landing. It's one of my 20 links. I called it Mechlore. Harry Bertoya's got a really cool barn that his son still helps keep alive out in Philadelphia or in New York upstate. And in the barn there's like 20 or 30 of these giant columns of sound. And then you can just walk through it, supposedly. I've seen a video and the guy just resonates all the different objects and it just creates this brash atmosphere. But getting back to what we got to cover. Noam Gabo is that guy that did the wire sculptures, but his famous work, it's the strange first kinetic work probably ever, is the one where he just puts a wire on a motor and then just holds it, or just turns it on. So everyone knows this piece. It's just a wire on a motor, but when you turn it on, it holds its nodes and antinodes. It holds that shape. So it's a new concept that you could sculpt with the blur of space. And just luckily, because like the analog photograph of this had the long shutter exposure, then its blur is captured. But you can think of these color mobiles that came around in the 50s and 60s. They can just put them on time-lapse photography while they're in the wind. All the different contingencies of them, it's going to make this really messy streams and streaks, just like an algo would do. You put some tracers on things. So just hunting around on the internet, I found this other artist named Bruce Gray, and he does art that's a little bit kinematic. Who knows how many Bruce Grays there are? Probably too many. But there's a little history you should know about these games of chance. In Japan, they have this thing called Pachinko machine where the game just kind of plays itself. You put balls into it and then they fall. If they fall in the right zones, then you get more balls or more points. You can cash out. It's gambling. Pinball was legal in America for at least 50 years because racketeers got involved and tried to turn it into like a pure gambling game. Because there was always this question of if it was a form of skill or it was a form of chance. And it was just right on the teeter-totter where people probably just ended up calling it a, superstitious devil machine. But you've seen people in the 70s and 80s refer to them as pinball wizards who've just learned the machine and then play it with skill rather than chance. But if you ever go and try to buy a pinball machine from like a pinball dealer guy, he's usually got a cache room of like all of the weird illegalized pinball machines that were like quasi-chance, quasi-skill from the 20s and 30s. I picked up some pinball machines for like $100 each that were just like, yeah, they're about to die or they're just dead. And they just had an astounding amount of mechanical electronic components in them. The ones from pre-70s, before things started getting integrated circuits, when there was still solid state memory. And by solid state, I mean like the physical position of the copper pin is what determines like how many bonuses you have, how many lives you have. It's pretty amazing if you open one up. And you can get a hint of it with the art of David Morrell. Hopefully we can find that, because I'd really like to show it to you. But David Morrell's work, how many David Morrells are there? You can see these things. They're just like giant contraption machines that have railways for marbles. Yeah, my website's not loading all the way. But he invented some solutions to logic problems with his marble railways. He's got this one where, say, a marble enters, and then it's got like teeter-totter. When it enters, it's either on the on-state or the off-state. When it goes to the left, then it ticks the mechanism somehow so that the next ball that shows up will be wanting to go to the right. So you made a gate that says switch like 1, 3, 5, 7 goes that way, 2, 4, 6 goes that way. So you got a splitter. It's just with a physical mechanism. And he's also got this other one that's a router where the ball shows up. And then it looks a lot like H.R. Geiger's kind of like human skeleton machine. Ball shows up and then it hits like this trigger that sends it down Route 1, but also knocks Route 1 out of the way. And then the next ball that shows up in line has access to Route 2, and then Route 2 takes something physically somewhere else and then knocks Route 2 out of the way. And so he's got a router that sets up 4 in a row, and then the 5th one that's allowed through resets the whole thing, just with the weight of the lever and the steel ball. His mechanism for getting the whole machine started is pretty ingenious. It's just perhaps like 2 pieces of steel that are a little bit smaller width than an actual marble. And then the marbles are kind of suspended in pins against those 2 pieces of steel. And then there's 1 piece of corkscrew steel. And just like the Archimedes screw, if you spin it clockwise, or counterclockwise, whichever one, then pins will just start sliding up continuous side. And so wherever you put one of these, you can take like a low potential energy and then say, well, now you've got an extra foot or 2 for some extra power. Because often Rube Goldberg machines, Rube Goldberg's actually you probably know him, but he's just a comic book or a cartoonist or a newspaper, and he would just make like political cartoons where, say, a bird is going to like eat some seeds over here, and thereby being a linkage that knocks its its butt goes in the air, its head goes down, and thereby takes an inclined plane away from the next thing that's like a wheel that's going to fall this way. And so he never was a machinist at all. He just created interesting conceptual machines. They would never work, but he definitely got inherited by our culture to be like, well, what's a Rube Goldberg does? He wasn't even a machinist, but he invented a new device. Usually they just refer to it as an extraneous machine that just does far too much work. It doesn't really accomplish anything. But in another way to refer to it, his book over in the library is called Chain Reaction, because his art's all about interconnection. And inherits a sound component, which is great. there's a spiral that turns a little step up. So just one motor. And then a bunch of potential energy is expressed. I don't know if this one's got the... Yeah, here they are. And you can see the welds on these pieces. Stuff like this, a lot of machines that you hand weld, you could like prefabricate the piece on a table, but then you have to install like the last weld in place. All right, now there's some kind of delay line. He's got one particular move where balls have to nest, and only when there's like 4 balls nested does the 4th one get popped out. So it's like a delay line. It's stable at 3 and knocks the 4th out. So those are pretty much all that computer programming is. It's just certain types of gates and certain types of delays. So just the inclination of these metal rods is kind of like the memory state of the machine. I don't know, it's a little dizzying after a while. 2 artists that I don't want to mention, I could probably do a better presentation about them sooner or later, is Bernie LaBelle with his pine gears and bladders. Him in particular, he'd make organic machines that he was trying to simulate emotion or resonate feelings out of. And if you make an intricate machine out of pine, which is like the softest wood ever, the gears are just going to be so unsatisfied. They're going to be so disenchanted with being gears that you're going to get moans, you're going to get cries out of the machine. So just like almost like feeling what the machine feels when you use soft material. And he's done some work with gears and reeds, bladders and reeds, such that he gets like whimpering, sad whines out of his bladders. And he says some kind of philosophical line about how if it sounds like, if it makes you think of it as human or alive, then that's it. That's all there is. And so his machines kind of try to transcend their inanimate materials. So op art, I showed you a little bit of it. It's this whole other species of art, but Vasarely is a good example of it, where they're just trying to imply movement. There's been a couple of games that have done some really good pachinko contingency worlds, kind of. I think there's a couple games also that have kind of like sandboxes where you're going to be given the tools and you're just told to like make your own game up. And on the Algodo forum, one question that they ask is like, is this real or is this just a simulation? Like some people would ask that question. And then the maker of Algodo says, well, of course it's just a simulation. Of course it's just a fantasy. It's just an approximation of real things. But every game's got its own concept of the interrelationship between objects. And so in this particular video, you're going to see in Scribblenauts, it's a little modular construction game where you're able to like hack, reality, make a perpetual motion machine. And I don't know, kids these days require this kind of game. They don't know how to play read-only games anymore, hopefully. I think the addiction with Minecraft's gone a little bit out of control with the youth. But I'll show you next in a little bit how you can use Minecraft to make, logic gates. I think it's a good learning tool. How kids game can supposedly you can compile Minecraft as a computer program in Minecraft as a computer simulation to be like playing Minecraft in Minecraft. It runs really slow. Maybe like 1 frame a year. But you play it on like a giant LCD screen that was made of Minecraft cubes. So in Algodo yesterday, I was making systems, and then I was like, well, I want the system to run itself. Like here's my mechanism. It makes something, but I want to have it itself be held up by it itself, so that you can see like the undulation of the mechanics, but in like a controlled by another version of itself. I'll show you what that looks like in a bit. But I had to do stuff like this, where I had to take the whole machine and weld it to what's above it. Because it's all about relative connection. And as you can see here, this car thinks that it's somehow generating its own momentum, even though it's connected to itself. It's real fun. I don't know if there's too many examples of troll physics, but it almost verges on like a game glitch, if you thought that it had to be a really well-modeled physics engine. But before we nerd out into Minecraft, I wanted to show you linkage computer. This guy's got the coolest class out in Camps University. Or no. Where's he from? Well, his name's like Xiao Chen. But he must be doing like master's or PhD work on taking like a really abstract mechanical function theoretical class. And he loves his teacher, but this guy was thinking about making linkage-based computers. And so his principle is that if the linkage is like, say 0 to 180, then it's on. If it's 180 to 360, then it's off. So you can make these mechanisms, we can do them just by copying these, where if you attenuate this upper link, then, so this is a translator that says any ons turns to off, or something like that. And that's the inverter thing. But like or, and, XOR, if and then, all the formal logic systems could be just represented by the phase of sticks. And so as you stroll through his website, you're going to see he used processing to generate these at a speed that's a little bit better than if you're actually going to connect these popsicle sticks. You'd probably run up against like the upper limits of torque if you invented this one physically. But you just give it a click and you can see a bunch of AND gates all supposedly physically interacting with each other to release a state or a logical function just derived from physics. And here's an example of it being done with paper, which it's a pretty fragile computer. There's some other stuff I wanted to go over about Illustrator, just to remind you, it's like the best program we have right now for 2D CAD. But if you bring up your Pathfinder window, which sometimes would be in Windows Pathfinder, and sometimes you can even customize Illustrator so that it's added to your sidebar, then there's like these 8 different transform modes, like like intersect, add, subtract kind of stuff. And I just took this random blurb of overlapping objects and then did all the different states of intersecting or pathfinding. And the particular one that I needed to show you was I think it's just called intersect, or just the merge one. And that's the one where the shape is just, the outer boundary of the shape is all that's left. And sometimes that can wreak havoc on these inner spaces. this particular object has just two inner spaces. But the purpose of that is so that you can get outlines. Because if you take outlines of a bunch of overlapping objects, you're going to have the object kind of cut itself up. But if you take the perimeter of an amount of object and then you get the outline of that, then you have a vector drawing that just like can pull the particular object right out of, and it will still remain whole. I thought this was a really great diagram. I wanted to remind you that we should probably be technological archaeologists. And then this little diagram is just like the what was it, Madison, Madel, the fellow that did the pinball art machines. Is once you get water moving in here, you can make this an algo do. It's two-dimensional enough. Then it streams out to the right until this second flue fills up the left side, so that the left side thinks that it's too heavy. And then once that happens, then it flips states, and then it'll, ideally, you know, both sides will get equal amounts of water, and it'll kind of average out one to the other. So this might be useful if you're going to do swapping, where like you wanted to like take barrels somewhere, so you'd say like, well, I want this machine to automatically fill up the other reservoir while I'm doing the barrel swap out on the other side. But luckily, I mean, when was this drawn? You know, this is 13th century. This is early stuff. But we could recreate this instantaneously. At the bottom of my page here, I think I don't know where, but there's a reference to. Oh, maybe it didn't upload. But there's this cool new thing on Thingiverse. I'll show you Thingiverse. Boing boing, 19th century. You might remember me saying that we kind of live in the dark ages, because only now in 2013 are we allowed to do like commons licensing on stuff that just derived from the 19th century. So this particular guy, he just goes through the patent office in 100 years in the past and takes all of these designs that are now free to be created, free to be shared, and he renders them in 3D. So who knows what this monstrosity was, if it was for sprinklers or for architecture, but it was, you know, intellectual data, which is practically what our nation is derived from. So if you go over to Thingiverse, you can see an example of, it's kind of like 3D Warehouse, but instead of specifically for SketchUp, it's just for CAD drawings in general. And this particular guy, he recreates things that were only just released in the 19th century. How strange. This is a great website, Thingiverse. I've gotten a couple things off of their site. But I was usually going to the zone where they only have like laser cut 2D drawings instead of 3D drawings. So you can search by tool. Looks like they've updated their interface since last I knew how to navigate it. Here, if you click on tool, then you can choose, well, I have access to this, I have access to this. Oh, no, that's wrong. It's just different ways to sort these content. But it's a great way to just become advised to what's happening in the 3D world. It's still a ways off, but having your own 3D printer at home, you know, in 10, 20 years, it'll be economical that within like a year you can fabricate more stuff than you could buy pre-assembled. Maybe 10 years, where it'll make sense. Like a lot of the economies just don't catch up until it makes economical sense. Like maybe how gasoline's, you know, finally at a place where it's like, well, there's other options. We don't have much choice. Yeah, so in AlgoDo, there's one download that I made in AlgoDo to show off. It's the one that looks like a conveyor belt. If you click on this one, then it'll open up AlgoDo's well, maybe in a while. I've been kind of annoyed by how Algodo is just not at the place where Photoshop is for really good multitasking. You have to relearn a bunch of unintuitive hotkeys, like rotate is not R, or R is scale. You know, it's like, okay, great, glad to know. And like the knife tool is T. You just don't think of these off the bat. But I wanted to show you this one particular operator called the CSG. It's the equivalent of the Pathfinder. And what you can do with it is you can carve a shape and then put it on top of another shape and then CSG cut it or subtract it. And then it'll make a composite shape that has like the negative space of this. So in this example here, I'll show you these particular little models over here. Like this is the model itself. It's just taking one contour and kind of noisifying it down here. But if you you put two in phase with each other, then you get like more complex shapes. Now over on this side, you just double click to draw something or to move the camera. I made this conveyor belt. I don't know if it's rolling right now. Yep, it's rolling. It's a little bit wonky, but on it is a machine that's just using slides. And so it's getting a particular but you can notice how every time it goes past that point, it makes a little jiggle that makes the motors a little bit less happy. But that's no big deal. I just grab the motor and make it stronger. So this is kind of like a spectroscope, kind of like a seismogram, where I'm getting the original frequency of the first machine, and then depending on the phase of the second machine, then I'll get a second contour. And so just if you notice that this machine has a couple of things, it has to have a counterbalance over here, and that could be optimized so that you could find out the exact weight of the left, and then the right has it also. And it also has these spot welds to make it so that the cam is connected to the shaft, but on the bottom one, the cam is connected to a different shaft so that it's inheriting the motion of the slider. My motor has hit the wall, so I think we need to reverse it. But this little conveyor belt thing seemed to be the easiest way to, easiest way to get a 2D plot, kind of like a streak of a system that's inherently just, it's just kind of stuck going up and down. So if you wanted to solve for time, then you just give it a motor and have it roll down a distance. The first time it was going to hit the wall, instead of making any kind of like programming that made it go back and forth or anything, I just took it and pressed R and then scaled it so that it had a longer space. Because, virtual space is pretty infinite. I was running into some trouble with making cams. This one right here, you can see its motor. It's got a motor on the key. So I press right, and I don't think anything happens. If I turn up the torque, then I can finally bridge past. So you just can't make that curve. Oh, now it can, but it's not smooth enough. It gets stuck there. You can take the knife tool and try in real time. If you're lucky, you can carve a part of the cam off, and it'll just fall. It's kind of fun. So what I was doing for some of these machines is like when they're graining against each other, I just press stop and then I do small little knife cuts to them. And then it's kind of hilarious when those little chips would just kind of fall out of the machine when I press play again. And once they reach the bottom of the ether, they just probably disappear from computer memory. Don't even need to delete them. But I don't know, I had a little bit of correspondence with this makers factory that's in town. They're the kind of people that have kids classes to teach them Minecraft and teach them 3D and 2D design principles. And I think they said that if they were to make, like, if they were going to take a 2x3 of plexiglass and do any kind of stencil cuts that you ever wanted to it, that would cost between $50 and $500 for them to do it themselves, which was pretty outrageous. You know, they're say $20,000 machine, like an hour of it's worth $50. So they're recouping their costs in like 400 hours or something. It's pretty good. But other options I've heard of are they have a makers space in San Jose and San Francisco, and they make you do it yourself. So they make you take a $100 class on learning how to use these tech tools. They have plasma cutters and water jets. So you take a little class on it, and then you yourself as the operator, you know, cut the middleman out and just pay, you know, raw rent time on the actual machine, which is probably a lot better than paying a technician. When you guys get to class and you see the welding tank, strangely enough, to fill an 80 cubic foot welding tank costs, say, $30, but to fill a 10 cubic foot welding tank costs about $15. So that discrepancy, where you're getting 7 times more material for twice as much money, is just the overhead to have a foreman dude pick up the tank, put it on a truck, take it to the supplier, and then fill it there. So half of the price of filling your tank is having a guy fill the tank for you, and the materials is actually just you know, a penny on top of that. So in AlgoDo, if you're good with the sketch tool, you can create most everything, but if you don't want to worry about that learning curve, there's a really simple tutorial in YouTube where you just write in sketch tool AlgoDo, and it'll, in less than 2 minutes, it'll show you all the things that the sketch tool can do. But just being kind of like an old-timey Photoshopper, you just hold your finger over these, and then you find out that scale is R. Eraser doesn't have a hotkey. G is gear. But it's good to remember that stuff, because the thing you're going to run up against in AlgoDo is it's not ergonomic. It's made by a PhD physician, so some things are really savvy, but other things are just like hitting your head against the wall. I was running up with the problem of you don't have control of layers, so if you make like a bulky thing on top of something else, I was looking for layers, but then I was like, well, okay, I'll just change the alpha. If you change the alpha, then the object, you don't have control of which one's on top unless you like really micromanage what you construct first. But if you just alpha it to 50%, then that makes it even look cooler, because then they're overlapping. So you shouldn't get into that trouble if you remember alpha control. This little joint, I thought was pretty cute. If you can see that. When you take two objects and you add them together with the CSG, which stands for like computer scale graphics or something, it'll make this little cheesy like butt weld, as if the two objects are physically wound together, which I thought was funny. I thought it would just merge both of them to be pink. I think most people on the forums are kind of, I don't know, they're just interested in something different. On the forums, they're just talking about like everything but how to do things. Like they just want to fantasize about making like physics wars. You know, like you put your character here, I put my character here, and they fight and like go for flags and stuff. But on the forums, I found this one guy whose signature picture is just an actual functioning mechanism for a blade in a spring-loaded thing. So I thought that was pretty cool that he just wants to get his design out there, even though it's pretty heinous, probably. Just to show you particularly a little bit about Illustrator. It's all Bezier curves and stuff, so that this hourglass shape is just made by 4 points and a couple Bezier curves. But if you beef up the thickness of this brush and then you go path, outline, stroke, then it'll create the inner and outer shape on like the super thinnest brush again. So you can almost do it nestedly, where you create a shape and then you take the inner and outer versions of a thickened version of it, and then you take those two inner and outer, and then you do thickened versions of those and take the outers of those. So it starts to look kind of like Rodochenko art, where it's just you know, dominoes, like Dazzler, gradients of white and black, white and black. So you know a little bit about Pathfinder. You can take any shape, like you don't have to draw it yourself. Like this is a Photoshop, or this is from the internet. You just drag a picture from an image file into Illustrator, and it'll be on like a smart mode because you can't really work with it. And you go up to Live Trace, and you just say Live Trace. There's lots of options. Just take the simplest one. I think I chose like Simple Trace, and then it'll turn your particular objects into all of the different color zones. You have to press Ungroup, right-click on Group to make them all specifically different. And then you can clean them up so that these shapes turn into these. And I wanted to show you, if you zoom in on them, they have an inner line and an outer line. So it can really cause you confusion to know if you're working on one line or if you're working on two lines beside each other. So sometimes you have to choose between them. For mobile design, this is the little wedge that you use to balance things. These really simple designed mobiles. All it is, you start from the bottom up and you just add balances. This guy, you see, it's like I'm at 10 minutes of his video about how to make balances, but I don't know. He's pretty wordy, but if you look him up, he's slightly famous, kind of like consumer artist. Another cool tool you can do in Illustrator is you can turn anything into a brush. So in this particular example, I checked the word Zubu, and then it selected it all, and then went over to the brush window, which is right here, and it says add new brush, and then I choose art brush, and then it takes the word Zubu, and then it uses that as my particular brush. So in this example, I got my Zubu brush, but I also got this wiggle brush, and so you can see that these are lines of the original design. But each one of these shapes is using the brush to make this shape, but using this particular vector brush. So you can do some really cool abstractions, where you take an abstraction and then you add another wiggle to it, and then Illustrator wholeheartedly attempts to interpolate your vector. It's a fun little glamour tool. There's some examples on Kinematics 5 about how to use Inkscape. I believe I should try to use it because it's a little bit difficult to use. So check this out. When it opens, it's like, yo, what am I supposed to do? Usually it runs on X11. Mikey over in Tech said that we don't have X11 because it's no longer exists. Like Mac sold it out to a third-party company. But he said that there's one called Quartz that it might run with. Yeah, so I don't know. If you see Quartz here somewhere, go for it, but we might be dead in the water for another week on using Inkscape, which would just completely replace Illustrator for technical drawings. Here's X-Quartz. I'll see if that does anything. But in Inkscape, if you get to it, it's a free program. Go to Render, and then these are all your options for rendering things. I'm always hanging out in Gear, but Spirograph's also an interesting one to go to. They also have an automated box maker, Spirograph. This is sculptures by Max Bill, early Kinetic sculptures before they hit the actually moving, you know, they just look moving. Here's the one by Man Ray that started it all. Here's an example of a Calder where he used just like weird shapes, and when they described this one in particular, they said that artists before him, like their secret determination for supposedly like why they can make kinetic art was that it was like aerodynamic, like it's moving through the air, so it's aerodynamic, or it's mathematical. But Calder, you know, he just marched into his own drummer, so he'd use these weird biomorphic forms which no one really thought he deserved to be hanging, and you know, create these juxtapositions. Here's the Vassarellis and the Duchamps. I already forget this guy's name. Luckily, he writes it in his pictures. Lyman Whitaker. And here's the man himself, Tim Healy. Here's one of his. He was really obsessed with race cars, and he would, towards the end of his career, he would deck out cars with automata. Who knows what for? Just to make a ruckus. Seemed to be his primary motivation. I mentioned who these were by at the beginning. I couldn't find it though at that time. His name was Bruce Gray. But just open pinball machine kinds of designs. You can imagine these shuddering during play. Just drop something into it. Here's a picture of Peggle, which is a pretty addictive little pachinko game you can download. Here's a close-up of those. Oh, this is metal gates. I don't know if we're going to weld one of those today. Here's a picture. See, this looks like H.R. Geiger skeleton. If you don't know who that is. There's a really cool dialogue between biological form and mechanical form, and characters like Geiger, think about ribs versus like delay lines. So this one just opens up one at a time until it reaches the end, and then this guy hits a lever that knocks them all back down again. And then here's another picture of Theo Jansen's. I recommend just checking out his ebook, learning about a tool set that no one ever really needed to fathom until his Strand Beasts came about. But yeah, if you have time, look into the Calder link and the George Rickey link. There's some online examples of a kid encountering Calder's warehouse. Both Calder and the Ames, who were famous chair designers, they both made like giant warehouses that had just a bunch of mirror glass on them. In the beginning of this movie, it's really epic how when you walk up to a house that's reflecting the sky, this is so cool looking. Where is your building? So anything was fair game for Calder. His first mobiles were just with glass, so they're kind of like stained glass mosaic works. I don't know how I could get any work done with all this stuff in his face.